Request taxi to gate.
Roger. Startup approved. Report taxi to holding point runway 25.
At parking.
Pushback approved at departure runway. Startup approved. Contact tower on 119 decimal. Departure runway 25. Contact when ready to start.
Departure runway 25. When ready to start.
Request cross runway.
Cross runway approved. Startup approved. Cross runway approved. Roger. Cross runway approved.
Holding point runway 25.
Contact tower on departure runway 25.
Departure runway 25. When ready to start. At parking. Information. Got.
Departure runway. Roger. Continue taxi to holding point runway. Contact tower on 119 decimal 450.
Request taxi.
Taxi to holding point runway 25.
Roger. Taxi to holding point runway 25.
Request startup.
At parking. Inform startup approved. Departure runway 25. Contact when ready to start. Departure runway 25. When ready to start.
Request pushback.
Pushback approved at own discretion. Pushback approved. Departure runway. Contact tower. Departure runway 25. Contact when ready to start.
At parking. Info departure runway 25.
Departure runway 25. Pushback approved at own discretion. Taxi to holding point runway 25. Holding point runway 07. Contact tower on. Pushback approved at own discretion. Startup approved. Startup approved. Pushback approved at own discretion. Startup approved. Pushback approved at own discretion. Pushback approved. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Request pushback.
Startup approved. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Request push. Roger.
Pushback approved at own discretion.
Roger.
Request startup.
Startup approved. Departure runway 25. Contact cross runway approved.
Roger. Cross runway approved. Request pushback.
Pushback approved at own discretion. Roger. Startup approved. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Startup approved. Call you.
Roger.
Departure runway 25. Taxi to holding point runway. Departure runway 25. Contact when startup approved. Report when ready to taxi. Startup approved. Taxi to holding point runway 25.
Roger. Taxi to holding point runway 25.
Request taxi. At park.
Taxi to holding point. Contact tower. Departure runway 2. Taxi to holding point runway 25.
Request taxi. Roger. Taxi to
holding. Departure runway. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi.
Startup approved.
Taxi to holding point runway. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi.
Startup approved. Call you back.
Taxi to holding point runway 25. Taxi to holding point runway 25.
Roger. Taxi to holding point runway 25.
Request taxi.
Request pushback.
Taxi to departure. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Roger.
Departure runway 25. When ready to start. Request startup.
Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi.
Startup approved. Call you back when ready to taxi.
Request taxi.
Taxi to holding point runway 25. Taxi to holding point runway 25.
Roger.
Departure runway 25. Contact when cross runway approved.
Roger. Cross runway approved.
Contact tower on 119.450.
Request taxi.
Taxi to holding point runway 34 left. Contact tower on 119. Contact tower on 11. Taxi to holding point runway 25.
Request cross runway.
Cross runway approved.
Roger. Cross runway approved.
At parking. Information, Golf.
Departure runway 25. Contact pushback approved. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi. Departure runway. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi.
Request pushback.
Pushback approved at own discretion.
Roger.
Request taxi.
Taxi to holding. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi.
Startup approved. Call you back.
Contact tower on 119.45. Contact tower on 119.450.
Request cross runway.
Cross runway approved.
Roger. Cross runway approved.
Taxi to holding point runway 25.
Roger. Taxi to holding point runway 25.
Request startup. Startup approved. Startup approved. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Roger.
Startup approved. Report when
Startup approved. Call you back when ready to taxi. Request taxi.
Holding point runway.
taxi to holding. Contact tower on 119. Contact tower. Taxi to holding. Contact tower on. Taxi to holding point runway 25.
Roger.
Roger. Taxi to hold.
Pushback approved at own discretion. Roger.
Request taxi.
Taxi to holding point runway 25.
Roger.
Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi.
Request startup.
Startup approved.
Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi.
Startup approved. Call you back when ready.
Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi. Taxi to holding point runway 25.
Roger. Taxi to holding point runway 25.
Departure runway 25. Departure runway 25.
Departure runway 25.
Contact tower on 11. Departure runway 25. Contact when ready to start. Request pushback approved at own discretion.
Roger.
Taxi to holding point runway 2. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Request startup.
Roger.
Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi.
Startup approved. Call you back when ready to taxi. At parking. Information, Golf.
Departure runway 25. Contact tower on Departure runway 2. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Request
Pushback approved at own discretion. Taxi to holding point runway 25.